There are relationship stories built on love, and then there are stories built on leverage. This one was always the second. When Charleston White spoke on Claressa Shields and Papoose, he didn't frame it as heartbreak. He framed it as miscalculation, as two people playing roles they never fully understood. And that's what stopped people in their tracks, because this wasn't about cheating rumors or messy timelines, not on the surface. According to Charleston White's commentary, this was about something deeper: power, image, and a relationship that looked loud online but was never solid in real life. He didn't say it fell apart, he said it was never built right. That distinction matters. Claressa has always been presented as strength personified, discipline, dominance, control, while Papoose has been positioned as loyalty, legacy, and experience. Together, they looked like balance, like purpose, like something real, but Charleston White challenged that image completely. He suggested the connection wasn't rooted in love, it was rooted in validation, ego, timing, and public attention that blurred the line between romance and relevance. And once that idea entered the conversation, everything people thought they understood started to wobble. Why did the relationship feel performative at times? Why did silence hit harder than statements? And why did this unravel so quickly once pressure arrived? This wasn't framed as betrayal, it was framed as inevitability. Because when something is built for the spotlight instead of stability, collapse doesn't come from one mistake. It comes from exposure. And according to Charleston White, exposure was always coming. This isn't a story about who cheated, it's not about who lied. It's about whether this was ever love at all, or just two people using each other to stand taller in public, until the structure couldn't hold the weight anymore. And once that question is asked, there's no going back. When Charleston White weighed in on the situation involving Claressa Shields and Papoose, he didn't do what most commentators do. He didn't chase screenshots. He didn't lean on timelines. He didn't frame it as a sudden betrayal. Instead, he questioned the foundation. Charleston's commentary wasn't about one argument or one rumor. It was about mismatch in life stage, power, and intention. He suggested that what people were calling love looked more like two individuals meeting each other's needs temporarily, not building something sustainable long-term. That framing is why his words landed differently, because calling a relationship messy invites debate. Calling it never love invites re-evaluation. He pointed to the way the relationship was presented publicly, heavy on affirmation, light on privacy. According to his take, real stability doesn't need constant proof. When something is solid, it doesn't need to be defended loudly. And the louder the performance, the more fragile the structure underneath tends to be. What really caught attention was how he framed roles. Charleston suggested Claressa wasn't just a partner in the relationship, she was the engine, the momentum, the visibility. And when one person is carrying both emotional and public weight, balance becomes hard to maintain. Love starts to look like obligation. Support starts to look like expectation. On the flip side, his commentary implied that Papoose's role wasn't malicious, but it wasn't equal either. Not villainy, positioning, being present in the spotlight without carrying the same risk, pressure, or scrutiny. That imbalance, according to Charleston, is where the cracks always form. Another reason his words resonated is that he didn't frame Claressa as weak. He framed her as overextended. Strong people, he argued, often mistake resilience for compatibility. They assume that because they can endure pressure, they should. That's not love, that's endurance. He also questioned timing. Why this relationship at this moment with these dynamics? According to his commentary, the pairing made sense publicly but not privately. It worked for attention. It worked for narrative, but it didn't work for longevity. And that's why, in his view, the unraveling felt fast. Not because it was rushed, but because it was never anchored. Charleston didn't accuse either party of deception. He suggested self-deception. Two people believing a story because it looked right from the outside. And once outside pressure hit, rumors, silence, scrutiny, the story collapsed under its own weight. This is why his take spread. It didn't ask the audience to pick sides. It asked them to reconsider assumptions. If love was real, why did it need so much defense? If loyalty was solid, why did silence feel so loud? And if the bond was mutual, why did it look so asymmetrical under stress? By framing the relationship as structurally flawed rather than emotionally chaotic, Charleston shifted the conversation. He made the breakup, or breakdown, feel less like a tragedy and more like an inevitability. That's uncomfortable because inevitability removes villains. And when there are no villains, the only thing left to examine is design. And that's where this story is headed next. To understand why Charleston White was so firm in saying this was never love, you have to look past personalities and focus on power and image. Not in a dramatic sense, but in a structural one. Because relationships don't fail only from betrayal, they fail from imbalance. From the outside, the pairing of Claressa Shields and Papoose looked compelling. A dominant, history-making athlete alongside a veteran artist known for loyalty and composure. Strength plus steadiness, drive plus experience, but Charleston White argued that what looked like balance was actually misalignment. Claressa's public identity is built on conquest. She wins, she leads. She carries pressure alone and still shows up. That kind of person doesn't just enter relationships, they power them. The momentum, the visibility, the narrative often follows them by default. In contrast, Papoose's public identity is rooted in legacy and restraint. He's known for being present, supportive, and grounded, but not for carrying the same level of public risk or scrutiny. That difference matters, because when one partner bears the majority of exposure, the relationship starts to tilt. Charleston's point wasn't that either person did something wrong. It was that the roles were uneven from the beginning. And uneven roles don't always feel wrong at first. In fact, they can feel complementary. One person drives, the other steadies. But over time, that dynamic can slip from partnership into dependency on image. This is where attention becomes a problem. According to Charleston's framing, the relationship thrived in the spotlight because the spotlight rewarded it. Affirmation poured in, praise followed. Every post felt like validation. And validation can masquerade as intimacy when the pressure is high. But attention isn't glue, it's amplifier. It amplifies strengths and weaknesses. When the relationship faced scrutiny, rumors, or silence, the imbalance became visible. The person carrying the image felt exposed. The person carrying less exposure felt insulated. That asymmetry changes how conflict is experienced. One side absorbs impact, the other observes it. Charleston suggested that's when the illusion breaks. Another key point he raised was timing. Claressa was in a phase of expansion, career, visibility, expectations all rising at once. That's a moment when stability needs to be quiet, grounding, and non-performative. Instead, the relationship remained public-facing, affirmation-heavy, and narrative-driven. That doesn't mean affection wasn't real. It means structure wasn't. Love that lasts usually reduces noise. It doesn't increase it. It doesn't need constant proof or reinforcement. When a relationship requires continuous public signaling, it often indicates uncertainty underneath. Charleston also questioned the idea of mutual sacrifice. Who was adjusting more? Who was carrying more emotional labor when pressure arrived? Who had more to lose if perception shifted? Those questions don't accuse, they reveal. In moments of stress, healthy relationships redistribute weight. Imbalanced ones expose who's been carrying it all along. And once that realization hits, things unravel quickly, not because of drama but because clarity arrives. This is why Charleston didn't frame the situation as heartbreak. He framed it as recognition. Recognition that the connection worked in a specific context, visibility, timing, attention, but not beyond it. And that's what made his commentary resonate. He stripped away romance and replaced it with architecture. How the relationship was built, what it was built to withstand, and what it was never designed to survive. Because love built for cameras doesn't collapse when cameras leave. It collapses when pressure tests arrive. And according to Charleston White, that test was always going to come. There's a moment in every public relationship when noise disappears, and what's left tells the truth. According to Charleston White, that moment came not with an argument, not with a viral clip, but with silence. And silence, when it arrives after heavy visibility, doesn't feel neutral, it feels like exposure. For a long time, the relationship between Claressa Shields and Papoose lived loudly. Posts, appearances, affirmations. The message was consistent. Unity, loyalty, strength. But then the volume dropped. No dramatic announcement, no public closure, just a noticeable absence where reassurance used to live. Charleston argued that this is where illusion breaks, not when something bad happens, but when nothing happens. When the public validation stops and the relationship has to stand on private structure alone. And that's where the imbalance showed itself. Claressa, by nature and career, is used to pressure. She thrives under it. But relationships don't work the same way championships do. You can't outtrain emotional misalignment. You can't dominate uncertainty into submission. When silence arrives, it forces stillness, and stillness reveals who's been holding the weight. According to Charleston's framing, Claressa was the one absorbing the silence, carrying the uncertainty. maintaining composure publicly while recalculating privately. Strength became expectation, and expectation became burden. Papoose, on the other hand, appeared insulated from that exposure. Not attacked, not challenged, not forced to clarify. That difference matters. Because when silence hits unevenly, it tells you who the relationship was protecting and who it wasn't. This wasn't about blame, it was about visibility under pressure. Another layer Charleston highlighted was timing. When the relationship faced its quietest moment, Claressa was at one of her most visible peaks. Pressure was coming from everywhere: career, attention, scrutiny. That's when relationships either ground you or drain you. Silence in that moment isn't peaceful, it's destabilizing. And destabilization exposes truth faster than conflict ever could. The illusion cracked not because something explosive happened, but because nothing rushed in to save it. No unified message, no coordinated reassurance. No shared front, just distance. Distance doesn't mean absence of feeling, it means absence of alignment. Charleston suggested that this is when realization sets in. The understanding that what felt like love under lights doesn't feel the same in shadow. That support that looked solid in public doesn't always translate privately. This is the quiet collapse people don't see. No tears on camera, no dramatic exits, just a slow recognition that the structure isn't holding. And once that recognition happens, there's no repairing the illusion. You can rebuild, but only if both people are willing to redistribute weight. If one person has been carrying more from the start, silence makes that imbalance impossible to ignore. That's why Charleston didn't frame this as heartbreak. He framed it as clarity, the moment when effort stops being mutual and starts being one-sided, when strength stops being admired and starts being relied upon. Because love isn't supposed to feel like endurance. And when silence reveals that it does, the relationship doesn't need a scandal to end. It just needs honesty, which leads to the final stage of this story: not exposure, not commentary, but decision. Every relationship reaches a point where emotion takes a backseat to cost. Not financial cost, but emotional, reputational, and psychological cost. According to Charleston White, this is the phase where everything became clear for Claressa Shields and Papoose. This wasn't about one argument or one rumor. It was about the realization that continuing required more sacrifice than leaving. Charleston's framing was blunt. When one person has to keep proving strength while the other benefits from it, the relationship quietly becomes a transaction. Not intentional, not malicious, just uneven. And unevenness sustained long enough turns love into obligation. In public, staying looks like maturity. It looks like loyalty. It looks like discipline. But privately, staying can feel like containment, holding yourself in place so the image doesn't collapse. And containment is exhausting. Claressa's position made this cost visible. Her identity is built on pushing through pain, enduring pressure, and performing under scrutiny. Those traits win championships, but they can trap people in relationships longer than they should stay. Because when you're known for endurance, quitting feels like failure, even when quitting is the healthiest move. Charleston argued that this is where strength becomes a liability. Staying would have meant continuing to carry the emotional weight and the public narrative. It would have meant absorbing silence, managing perception, and protecting a structure that wasn't distributing weight equally. That's not partnership. That's maintenance. On the other side, walking away carries a different cost: public judgment, speculation, questions about timing and motive, the risk of being framed as impulsive or emotional. But that cost is finite, it peaks and fades. Staying costs you daily. This is why Charleston framed the outcome as inevitable rather than dramatic. Once someone reaches the point where staying demands self-erasure, the decision isn't emotional, it's strategic. It's about preservation. Another layer he pointed out was dignity. Not pride, but dignity. The difference between being seen as strong and being used as a symbol of strength for someone else's stability. When that line blurs, resentment grows quietly. And resentment doesn't explode, it calcifies. Charleston suggested that the real turning point wasn't public reaction. It was private arithmetic, the moment when effort, risk, and reward stopped balancing. When the relationship required continuous defense instead of mutual ease. This is why no dramatic closure followed. No final speech. No public breakdown. Because decisions made at this stage don't need spectacle. They need finality. Walking away doesn't mean love never existed. It means love wasn't sustainable under the structure that surrounded it. And acknowledging that isn't weakness, it's clarity. Charleston's most cutting point was this: if a relationship requires you to shrink your needs to keep the peace, It was never designed for you to thrive. That's not heartbreak, that's design failure. And once someone sees that clearly, staying becomes the more expensive option. Which brings us to the end, not of the relationship, but of the illusion. By the time Charleston White finished his commentary, the story no longer sounded like breakup drama. It sounded like a post-mortem. Not on a relationship that failed, but on one that was never built to last. According to his framing, love requires balance when pressure arrives. It requires mutual protection when silence hits. And it requires redistribution of weight when one person is carrying more than their share. What he saw instead was endurance mistaken for devotion, visibility mistaken for intimacy, and strength mistaken for compatibility. For Claressa Shields, strength was always the headline, but strength, when over-relied on, becomes a liability. It teaches people to lean instead of lift, to benefit instead of contribute. And once that pattern sets in, love quietly turns into labor. For Papoose, Charleston didn't assign villainy. He assigned position, a place of comfort within a structure that asked less of him when things got heavy. And relationships don't break only because someone does wrong. They break because responsibility isn't shared when it matters most. That's why Charleston didn't say the relationship collapsed. He said it expired. Because once clarity replaces hope, there's no rebuilding the illusion. You don't argue with reality, you adjust to it. And adjustment in this case meant choosing self-preservation over performance. So the real takeaway isn't gossip. It's design. If love needs constant defense, it's not stable. If silence hurts one person more than the other, it's not equal. And if staying costs more than leaving, it's not love, it's endurance. Now it's on you. Was this relationship doomed by imbalance from the start? Did strength get mistaken for compatibility? And how often do we confuse public validation with real partnership? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this if you believe relationships fail less from betrayal and more from design flaws. Because sometimes the truth isn't that love was lost, it's that it was never there in the first place.